16,000 kilometres of canals have been dug across the Mississippi Delta, enough to stretch nearly halfway around the world. They have been built by one industry: oil. Port Fourchon, right on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, just 40 kilometres south of New Orleans, is one of the biggest service ports for the US oil supply.
Oil and gas platforms producing oil and gas and through a pipeline system delivering it through the port, and then actually it's going to over 50% of the US's refining capacity through pipeline systems from here.
The irony is that the existence of the canals now threatens the industry that built them. After the 2008 hurricane season, this broken seawall is the only defence that stands between a significant part of the US oil supply and catastrophe. The oil industry is frantically trying to repair the seawall.
We could find ourselves sitting through a hurricane season with this kind of vulnerability, which would not be very good. I would not sleep very comfortably if in fact we have not done any major hardening of this first line of defense to protect the port.
Despite Hurricane Katrina, marshland is still shrinking. Roads are being built and pipelines sunk across it. According to Louisiana State University, the Delta is the fastest disappearing landmass on Earth. That's the measure of the task facing Dr. Reed and the department charged with reversing the development pattern of the last 150 years.
One of the greatest resources we have to save coastal Louisiana, the sediment in the river, is going into the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. 120 million tons of sediment a year. That's enough to fill the Superdome in Louisiana to the brim 11 times every year.
Ile de Jean Charles was a Cajun community of 2,000 people making a living from fishing and hunting in the Delta.
It's emblematic of the whole coastal region, these coastal communities that are having to either relocate or just will no longer survive. Within the past 10 years, this community has flooded 5 times. From Rita and also Ike, they had anywhere from 8 to 10 feet of water over the road in most of these houses.
Every year, the only road to Ile de Jean Charles gives away a little more to the ocean. In southern Louisiana, land loss makes for some difficult choices.
The storm has undermined the backside of the road, and unfortunately, the cost associated with the road repair exceeds that of the value of the property on the island. And the unfortunate reality is the parish is going to have to determine whether or not financially it's in the parish's best interest to repair the road. In the event of not repairing the road, you're essentially abandoning the community.
Since Katrina, the US Corps of Engineers has spent $10 billion building artificial levees to protect the city of New Orleans. Safeguarding the whole of southern Louisiana using artificial barriers would require many billions more. Conservationists are pressing for the bulk of the funds to be spent on restoration of the natural barrier. To do so will involve diverting the course of the mighty Mississippi to something that resembles its original winding path across the Delta, and an estimated bill of $100 billion. Scientists like Professor Reed believe that there is simply no alternative, and she is cautiously optimistic that some kind of compromise can be reached.
I don't believe that we really think we should be navigating and trading goods in the 21st century the same way that we did it in the 19th and 20th centuries. Things are going to be different. The navigation industry is going to have to change to accommodate that. If they need to make changes, and we need to make changes in the river to help make a sustainable coast, then I think there's a sweet spot there that we've got to find. And I'm optimistic that we can find this. This is engineeringly feasible. It's big, yeah, it's big. But we can do this. This is like going to the moon for ecosystem sustainability. We just have to want to do it. The technology is there, the will has to be there.
Cuba and Haiti are Caribbean neighbours, just 120 kilometres from each other. Both share a colonial past, but when it comes to being prepared for disaster, they are a world and more apart.
There were many floods. They happened at night, so people could not flee.
Haiti, the oldest independent nation in the Caribbean, is the Western Hemisphere's first failed state. It's a sorry example of what bad governance can do to a country. 80% of the fast increasing population lives in desperate poverty. 40% of Haiti's GDP comes from foreign aid, and most of the rest from remittances of Haitians who have escaped to the US. The environment is so degraded that bare hillsides are hemorrhaging the last of its topsoil out to sea. When a hurricane hits Haiti, as they often do, the 8 million people who live there are helpless. No trees to buffer the winds, no soil and roots to prevent landslides. In 2008, over 1,000 died in the town of Gonaive alone after Hurricane Ike. Just over the horizon, Cuba lost only 4 people to the same hurricane. Why?
Is the government prepared? Do we have an evacuation plan? Do we have good infrastructure to evacuate people? And do we have forests to absorb the rain? I think every time we see a hurricane heading towards Haiti, we are very alarmed. We know Cuba can manage, Jamaica can manage, Grenada can manage. They've got well worked out evacuation plans. In Cuba, the population will be evacuated before disaster strikes. In Haiti, there's lack of government, lack of infrastructure. Any rain is going to turn into flash floods. So Haiti, in many ways, is just it's a catastrophe that's always going to happen.
This is the front line of Cuba's defence against hurricanes, and this is the man in charge of protecting it.
This is our first line of defense against these weather events that every year seem to be more frequent in the Caribbean. This is a natural barrier with mangroves and palm trees that help to dissipate the energy of these storms. If we get rid of these barriers, then we would spend a fortune making artificial barriers. They would never be as effective as nature.
Like Haiti, Cuba was colonized to grow cash crops, chiefly sugar and tobacco for Europeans. Even after Fidel Castro's revolution 50 years ago, change was slow to happen.
Centuries of colonial exploitation left our environment very degraded. The economic blockade imposed by the US hurt our economy and our environment, and initially we copied many of the development mistakes of the past.
During the 60s and 70s, Cuba's special relationship with the Soviet Union turned it into a highly subsidised provider of commodities for the Eastern Bloc. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the island has had to reinvent itself. In the streets of Havana, many cars might still be relics of the 1950s, but the country's environmental policies are not. According to the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Socialist Cuba is the only country in the world practicing sustainable development.
Environmental policies alone end up in failure if they do not take into account the other elements of sustainability. I think Cuba is an interesting example of trying to balance the 3 elements: the economic factors, the social and the environmental. It's not perfect. We have made many mistakes, but I think it's a worthwhile example.
Since the early 90s, Havana has made over half of Cuba's coastline officially protected. And according to Orlando Rey Santos, it's a deliberate part of its disaster management plans, alongside hurricane-proof housing and highly effective evacuation measures.
Cuba is virtually the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean that has increased its forest cover in the past 15 years. That means more trees and mountains and more mangroves on our beaches. This gives us more protection from hurricanes and storms. It's a simple and proven equation. The better the conservation of these ecosystems, the better the protection against weather events of this nature.
As a result of its policies, Cuba has some world-class wetlands. Activities like farming of these native crocodiles, brought back from the brink of extinction, help to create much-needed revenues. But the single most important function of this ecosystem is to provide protection.
Governments have got a responsibility to protect their citizens. How they interpret that, whether it's flood defences, what's the economic trade-off, what is the level of risk. If we look at the climate scientists' predictions on the increase of disasters, increase in sea temperatures, that in itself is a disaster. It is not going to happen in our reality, it is happening today.